The evening sky was painted in soft oranges and purples as a young high school student headed home from her shift at the local coffee shop. The gentle hum of her well-maintained Honda Civic filled the quiet street as she drove through the familiar neighborhoods of her small town. Her graduation photo hung from the rearview mirror, swaying slightly with each turn, a reminder of her recent achievement and the bright future ahead. Just 2 blocks from home, red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her mirror. Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, doing exactly what her parents had taught her. She signaled, pulled over safely, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. The maintenance receipt from last week's checkup sat in her glove compartment, including the inspection of all lights. She knew everything was working perfectly. Officer Reynolds approached her window with heavy footsteps that seemed to echo in the quiet street. His face was set in a stern expression that made her stomach twist with unexpected anxiety. She'd had pleasant interactions with other officers before, including Officer Chen, who regularly visited the coffee shop, but something felt different this time. "License and registration," he demanded, not even bothering with the customary greeting. His flashlight beam swept across her face, then lingered uncomfortably long on her hair, the beautiful crown of natural curls she'd spent years growing and maintaining. Her fingers stayed steady as she reached for her documents, movements deliberate and slow. "Sir, may I ask why I was pulled over?" she asked politely, her voice clear but respectful. The question seemed to trigger something in the officer's demeanor. His jaw tightened, and the flashlight beam became more aggressive, sweeping across her car's interior. "Broken taillight," he snapped, though she knew that couldn't be true. Her father had helped her check all the lights just days ago, and they'd even taken a video showing everything working perfectly. A family habit born from years of unnecessary stops. The next few moments would change everything. As she opened her mouth to mention the recent inspection, Officer Reynolds' hand moved to his belt, and his voice took on a tone that made nearby pedestrians stop and take notice. What happened next would spark a nationwide conversation about power, respect, and the need for change in law enforcement. Little did anyone know that just 10 minutes later, the same handcuffs Officer Reynolds kept reaching for would be closing around his own wrists. But first, the situation would escalate in ways that would shock not just their small community, but the entire nation. A young woman walking her dog across the street slowed her pace, phone already in hand. An elderly couple on their evening walk stopped completely, their years of life experience telling them something wasn't right. And somewhere in the distance, a police dashboard camera recorded everything, its unblinking eye capturing what would soon become evidence in a case that would make headlines across the country. The crisp autumn air carried the sound of approaching sirens. But they weren't coming for who everyone initially thought they would be. The next few minutes would prove that sometimes justice arrives swiftly and unexpectedly, turning the tables on those who abuse their power. The young student's heart pounded as she reached for her phone, carefully keeping it visible on the dashboard. She'd learned from her parents to record any interaction that felt wrong, and something about Officer Reynolds' aggressive stance set off every warning bell in her mind. Her finger trembled slightly as she pressed record, the screen capturing the officer's increasingly hostile expression. "I have the inspection receipt right here," she said softly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "From last Tuesday, they checked all the lights." The words caught in her throat as Officer Reynolds suddenly slammed his hand against her car door, making the whole vehicle shake. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, his voice carrying across the quiet street. The elderly couple watching from their evening walk quickly pulled out their phones too, instinctively knowing they needed to document what was unfolding. The young dog walker across the street had already started live streaming, her hands shaking but determined to capture everything. The cool evening air hit her face as she carefully opened her door, movements slow and deliberate. Her coffee shop uniform still smelled faintly of freshly ground beans, a reminder of the normal day that had suddenly turned surreal. She could feel her carefully styled hair brushing against her shoulders, each curl a testament to years of growth and care. "Turn around," Officer Reynolds demanded, his voice dripping with an authority that seemed to grow more unstable by the second. The dashboard camera in his patrol car recorded his every move, though he seemed to have forgotten its existence entirely. His hand kept twitching toward his belt, making nearby witnesses hold their breath. "Sir," she began, her voice clear but trembling slightly, "I don't understand what I've done wrong. If you could just look at the inspection paperwork." Her words were cut short by the sound of backup sirens in the distance, but they weren't the ones Officer Reynolds had called for. Someone else had seen enough. The growing crowd of bystanders had swelled to include people from nearby houses, many filming with their phones. A middle-aged teacher from the local high school stepped forward, her presence familiar and comforting. "Officer," she called out firmly, "we're all witnessing this." But Officer Reynolds seemed to have entered a different reality altogether. His face had taken on a reddish hue, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "You people always think you know better," he spat out, each word filled with venom. "Always with the attitude, always with the hair." The young student's eyes widened as his words revealed the true nature of his actions. This wasn't about a taillight. It had never been about a taillight. Her fingers intertwined nervously with the hem of her uniform shirt, a habit she'd had since childhood when facing unfair situations. A gentle breeze carried the sound of more approaching sirens, closer now. The teacher had stepped even closer, phone steady in her hand as she documented everything. Other neighbors had gathered on their porches, creating a circle of witnesses that seemed to enrage Officer Reynolds even more. Time seemed to slow down as he reached for something on his belt. But instead of the weapon everyone feared, he pulled out a pair of scissors, standard police issue for cutting seat belts in emergencies. The glint of metal under the streetlights sent a chill through the growing crowd. The young student's voice caught in her throat as she realized what was about to happen. Years of growing her hair, of learning to love and care for it, of connecting with her heritage through every curl, all of it was about to be violated by someone who had sworn to protect and serve. The dashboard camera kept recording, its red light blinking steadily in the growing darkness. It captured every second of what happened next, footage that would soon be seen by millions. But more importantly, it captured the exact moment when justice decided enough was enough, and chose to arrive exactly when it was needed most. The streetlights cast long shadows across the gathering crowd as Officer Reynolds raised the scissors, their metal surface reflecting the red and blue lights still flashing from his patrol car. The young student's eyes widened in disbelief, her reflection fragmenting in the polished blades. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not in front of so many witnesses. "You need to learn respect," he growled, his voice barely recognizable as human anymore. The teacher who had stepped forward earlier found her own voice shaking as she called out, "Stop this right now." This is being recorded, but her words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall of rage that surrounded the officer. Time seemed to slow down as the first lock of carefully maintained hair fell to the pavement. The young student felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Your hair is your crown, your heritage, your strength." Each snip of the scissors felt like a direct attack on those memories, those family connections. The dog walker's live stream counter ticked up rapidly as more viewers joined, watching in horror as the officer continued his power-drunk rampage. Comments flooded in faster than anyone could read them, a digital tsunami of outrage and calls for action. Somewhere in that stream of comments, a police lieutenant was watching, already grabbing his keys and radioing for backup. "Years," the student whispered, her voice steady despite everything. "Years of growth, years of care, years of pride." Each word seemed to fuel Officer Reynolds' frenzy, but they weren't meant for him. They were a testimony, a record, a statement to everyone watching that this moment would not break her spirit. The elderly couple had moved closer, the wife clutching her husband's arm as they continued filming. Their own granddaughter wore her hair the same way, and tears streamed down the grandmother's face as she watched this abuse of power unfold. Her husband's free hand was already dialing their lawyer's number. They would not let this pass. More hair fell to the ground, creating a dark halo around the student's feet. The autumn wind picked up some strands, carrying them away like broken promises of protection and service. The teacher had started narrating everything for her recording, her educator's instinct kicking in to document every detail. Officer badge number 247, continuing to cut her hair without consent or cause. Then, through the gathered crowd, came the sound of running feet. Heavy boots on pavement, getting closer. Officer Reynolds was so caught up in his act of cruelty that he didn't notice the approaching figures until it was too late. His lieutenant and 3 other officers had arrived, their faces set in expressions of shock and determination. "Reynolds!" The lieutenant's voice cracked like thunder across the scene. "Drop the scissors. Now." The authority in his voice was different from Reynolds. It was the real thing, backed by justice and responsibility rather than prejudice and power abuse. The young student stood perfectly still as the scissors clattered to the ground. Strands of her hair still floated in the evening breeze, but she held her head high. Around her, phones captured every moment as Officer Reynolds' face shifted from rage to confusion to the first hints of fear as realization set in. The lieutenant's voice was ice cold as he read Reynolds his rights, each word crystal clear in the now silent street. The handcuffs clicked shut around Reynolds' wrists, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the crowd in shocked silence. A chorus of voices rose up, offering jackets, comfort, and promises to testify. The young student finally allowed herself to reach up and touch what remained of her hair. But instead of crumbling, she squared her shoulders and looked directly into the nearest camera. This moment of violation would become a catalyst for change, and somewhere deep inside, she already knew that her story would help prevent this from happening to anyone else. As Reynolds was led away to a waiting patrol car, the lieutenant paused to gently ask if she was okay. Her response, caught on dozens of cameras and soon to be shared millions of times, was both heartbreaking and powerful. "My hair will grow back stronger." But his badge is gone forever. Within minutes of the first video hitting social media, phones across the city lit up with notifications. The live stream had already gathered over 50,000 viewers, and the numbers were climbing by the second. Local news stations scrambled to get reporters to the scene, their vans creating a small traffic jam on the usually quiet suburban street. The young student's parents arrived just as the second police car was pulling away with Officer Reynolds. Her mother's gasp echoed through the crowd as she saw what remained of her daughter's hair, but it was quickly followed by a fierce embrace that spoke of protection and unconditional love. Her father, still in his work clothes, stood protectively beside them, one hand gently resting on his daughter's shoulder while the other clutched his phone, already speaking with their family lawyer. "We saw everything." The elderly couple stepped forward, their phones still recording. "We'll testify to whatever's needed." The wife reached out to squeeze the mother's hand, a gesture that crossed all barriers of age and background. The dog walker who had started the live stream was now surrounded by reporters, her voice steady as she described what she had witnessed. The local coffee shop where the student worked had closed early, and its employees arrived in a group carrying drinks and snacks for everyone. The shop owner, a grandmother of 4, wrapped a beautiful scarf around the student's shoulders, whispering words of encouragement that brought fresh tears to many eyes. Social media exploded with activity. The hashtag Justice for Her started trending nationally within an hour. Local civil rights activists were already organizing a peaceful protest for the next morning, while legal organizations offered their services pro bono. The video had been shared by several prominent civil rights leaders, each adding their voice to the growing chorus demanding accountability. The police chief herself arrived on scene, her face set in grim determination. Instead of retreating to headquarters, she chose to address the gathered crowd directly. "What happened here today," she announced, her voice carrying across the now silent gathering, "is not what we stand for. It is not what that badge represents, and it will not go unpunished." Inside homes across the city, families gathered around TV screens and phones, watching the story unfold. Parents held their children closer, having difficult but necessary conversations about power, respect, and standing up for what's right. Local hair salons began posting offers of free services, while a nearby beauty supply store announced it would donate hair care products to support the young student's recovery. The teacher who had witnessed everything was now sitting with a group of students who had arrived from the high school. They were making posters for tomorrow's protest, their young faces set with determination to see justice served. "This isn't just about hair," one student explained to a reporter. "It's about dignity, respect, and using power to help, not hurt." As evening turned to night, the crowd didn't disperse. Instead, someone brought electric lanterns, creating a warm glow that pushed back against the darkness. Local restaurants sent over boxes of pizza and containers of hot coffee. The community wasn't just witnessing. They were coming together, showing what real protection and service looked like. A community leader stood up on a nearby bench, her voice carrying over the gathered crowd. Let this be the moment we remember not for its cruelty, but for how we stood together against it. Let this be the day we show our young people that justice isn't just a word, it's an action we take together. The young student, still wrapped in the coffee shop owner's scarf, watched as more people arrived with each passing minute. Her story was becoming their story, her pain transforming into their shared determination for change. Social media comments poured in from across the country, each one a digital hand reaching out to help lift her up. As midnight approached, the crowd had grown rather than diminished. Someone started singing, and others joined in, their voices rising into the night air. The young student's mother held her close, and in that moment, surrounded by the strength of her community, she felt something unexpected: hope. This wasn't the end of her story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. Back at police headquarters, the chief sat in her office, her face illuminated by multiple screens. Each one showed a different angle of the incident: the patrol car's dashboard camera, body camera footage, and dozens of witness videos that had flooded social media. Her hands, usually steady after 20 years on the force, trembled slightly as she watched the footage replay. Get me internal affairs, records, and legal. Now. Her voice carried down the hallway, prompting immediate action. Within minutes, her office filled with department heads, each falling silent as they watched the videos. The chief hit pause on a frame that showed Officer Reynolds' face clearly, twisted with an anger that had no place behind a badge. 10 minutes, she announced, standing up. That's all I need to make this decision. The room stayed quiet as she pulled Officer Reynolds' personnel file, scanning through previous complaints that suddenly took on new meaning. 3 warnings about excessive force, 2 citizen complaints about discriminatory language, all swept under the rug by previous administration. Down in the holding area, Officer Reynolds sat alone in an interview room, his badge and gun already surrendered. Through the one-way glass, 2 veteran detectives watched him fidget, noticing how his arrogance had melted away once his lieutenant had snapped those handcuffs around his wrists. The young student's statement was being taken in another room, her parents by her side, as she recounted every detail with remarkable composure. The female detective taking notes had to pause several times, moved by the strength in this young woman's voice as she described not just what happened, but how it made her feel. He didn't just cut my hair, she explained, her mother's hand tight in hers. He tried to cut away my dignity, but that's something no one can take from you unless you let them. The detective nodded, adding another box of tissues to her growing collection of evidence. Upstairs, the chief's 10 minutes were up. She stood before her assembled team, her decision made. This isn't just about one officer or one incident, she began, her voice firm. This is about trust, about what that badge means, about who we are supposed to be in this community. She pulled up Reynolds' booking photo on the main screen. Former Officer Reynolds will be charged with assault, civil rights violations, and abuse of power under color of authority. No paid leave, no administrative review, no drawn-out investigation. He's done. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. In the courthouse across the street, a judge was already reviewing the emergency filing. She'd cancelled her dinner plans the moment she saw the videos, knowing this couldn't wait until morning. Her clerk worked quickly, preparing the necessary paperwork as she watched the footage for the 3rd time. This isn't just assault, the judge commented, signing the charging documents. This is an attack on everything that badge is supposed to represent. She checked her watch. Less than an hour had passed since the incident, and already the wheels of justice were turning at unprecedented speed. Back at headquarters, the chief stepped out to address the growing crowd of reporters. Camera lights blazed as she approached the podium, but she didn't need her prepared statement. The words came straight from her heart. Today, one of our officers forgot what that badge means. He forgot his oath, his duty, and his humanity. But let me be clear, we have not forgotten. Justice will be swift, it will be thorough, and it will set an example for every department in this country. As she spoke, Reynolds was being processed into the county jail. His former colleagues showed no special treatment as they took his fingerprints and mugshot. In less than 10 minutes, the man who had wielded his power so cruelly was now wearing an orange jumpsuit, his former authority stripped away as quickly as he had tried to strip away a young woman's dignity. Support for the department's swift action poured in from across the country. Other police chiefs called to commend the quick response. Civil rights leaders praised the unprecedented speed of justice. But perhaps the most powerful response came from the young student herself, who posted a simple message online. "Thank you for showing that justice can be as swift as injustice. This is how we rebuild trust." The morning after the incident dawned with a different energy in the city. Local news crews captured an extraordinary sight. Hundreds of people gathering outside the police station, not in anger, but in solidarity. They carried signs reading "Change starts here" and "Community strong." Many of them wore head wraps and scarves in support of the young student. Inside her home, the student sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by family. Her grandmother's hands moved gently through what remained of her hair, applying oils and whispering stories of strength passed down through generations. "Hair grows," she said softly, "but character, that's already blooming in you like a garden in spring." The family's living room had transformed into an impromptu command center. Their dining table was covered with letters, cards, and messages from across the country. A popular natural hair care company had sent boxes of their finest products. Local salon owners kept calling, offering their services and support. At the high school, students organized a solidarity day. Hundreds showed up wearing head coverings, regardless of their own hair type or background. The principal, moved by the display, announced a new cultural awareness program would become part of their regular curriculum. "Sometimes," she told the assembled students, "the most powerful lessons come from our hardest moments." The police department was undergoing its own transformation. The chief had ordered a complete review of all policies and training procedures. Officers were being assigned to community engagement programs, not as authority figures, but as learners. The elderly couple who had witnessed everything were invited to speak at the police academy, sharing their perspective on what real protection and service should look like. Social media continued to amplify the story, but in unexpected ways. Instead of focusing on the trauma, people shared stories of their own hair journeys, their cultural traditions, and moments when communities came together to support one another. The hashtag evolved from hashtag Justice for Her to hashtag Growing Stronger Together. Local barbershops and beauty salons joined forces to organize a community healing event. They set up chairs in the park, offering free services while facilitating conversations about respect, understanding, and unity. Children sat together, learning to braid friendship bracelets while their parents shared stories and built connections that crossed all social boundaries. The coffee shop where the student worked became an unofficial community center. Customers left generous tips with notes of encouragement, and the tip jar quickly transformed into a scholarship fund. The shop owner added a new drink to the menu, a sweet and strong blend called the Survivor, with all proceeds going to organizations fighting discrimination. In the courthouse, systemic change was taking root. The judge who had processed the initial charges was now working with legal experts to draft stronger protections against abuse of power. Police departments from other cities sent representatives to learn from how this incident was handled, taking notes on the swift response that had turned a moment of cruelty into a catalyst for change. The young student's parents noticed subtle changes in their daughter. Though still processing the trauma, she stood taller, spoke more confidently. When a national news program requested an interview, she agreed, but with one condition. The focus had to be on moving forward, not dwelling in pain. During that interview, she revealed her plans to study law, inspired by the swift justice she had witnessed. "What happened to me was terrible," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But what happened after? That's the real story. That's what people need to see. How a community can come together, how change can happen in an instant if we all decide it must." As evening fell on the city 1 week after the incident, the community gathered again, this time for a celebration of culture and unity. The park filled with music, food, and demonstrations of traditional hair care from various cultures. Children ran between booths learning about different traditions, while adults shared stories and contact information, building networks of support that would last far beyond this moment. 1 month after the incident, the young student stood before a packed city council meeting. Her hair was growing back beautifully, styled with the help of local beauticians who had become like family. But it wasn't her appearance that commanded attention, it was the quiet confidence in her voice as she addressed the room. "A haircut was meant to shame me," she began, her words carried live on local television. Instead, it awakened something in all of us. The chamber fell silent as she shared her vision for community policing reform, ideas developed through countless conversations with both officers and citizens over the past weeks. In the audience, familiar faces nodded in support. The coffee shop owner who had first wrapped her in a scarf, the elderly couple who had witnessed everything, the teacher who had stepped forward, the dog walker whose live stream had helped justice arrive swiftly. They had started as strangers united by circumstance, now they were family bound by purpose. The changes were already visible across the city. The police department had transformed its training program, with community members now serving as regular speakers. Officers attended cultural awareness sessions not as a punishment, but as an opportunity for growth. The chief had implemented a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, backed by swift and transparent accountability. Local salons had turned their initial offer of free services into a permanent program, providing care and support to anyone recovering from discrimination or trauma. The Scholarship Fund, started with coffee shop tips, had grown into a foundation supporting students pursuing careers in civil rights law and community advocacy. The young student's story had sparked change beyond their city limits. State legislators were debating the Sturgeon Act, protecting against hair discrimination. Other police departments nationwide were studying how this incident had been handled, learning from the swift response that had turned tragedy into transformation. But perhaps the most profound changes were the smallest ones. In school hallways, students from different backgrounds shared hair care tips and cultural traditions. At community events, people who might never have spoken before found themselves deep in conversation. The barriers between us and them were slowly dissolving, replaced by a growing understanding that everyone's story mattered. The former officer's trial was approaching, but it no longer dominated the community's conversation. Instead, people talked about the mentorship program, where officers and teens met weekly to share perspectives and build understanding. They discussed the new cultural heritage festivals being planned and the police department's commitment to hiring officers who reflected the community's diversity. The young student had received acceptance letters from several law schools, each offering full scholarships. But she chose to defer for a year, accepting invitations to speak at police academies and community organizations across the country. Her message was always the same: real change happens when we turn pain into purpose. Her parents watched with pride as she evolved from victim to advocate. Her mother often found herself sharing their story with other parents, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that community solidarity could turn darkness into light. Her father had joined the Civilian Oversight Board for the police department, bringing his perspective as both a parent and a community member. The coffee shop created a wall of photos showing the community's journey over the past month. Pictures of protest signs had given way to images of joint community police barbecues. Photos of angry crowds were replaced by scenes of children learning about each other's cultures. The last image showed the young student surrounded by a diverse group of young people at a leadership workshop she had organized. 1 year to the day after the incident, the community gathered in the same park where it had all happened. But this time, they came to celebrate. The young student cut a ribbon to open the new Community Unity Center, a space dedicated to fostering understanding and healing. As she looked out at the crowd, officers chatting with teenagers, families sharing food, children playing together, she smiled, knowing that sometimes the worst moments can bring out the best in people. "My hair grew back stronger," she told a reporter who asked for a final reflection, "but our community, it grew back extraordinary."